Thank you so much. Well, I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to present, and thank the sponsors who are here. It's great to see investments being made in the space, and the growth of interest and popularity of the technology. I do want to just, as part of my preamble, say a few words about. This is probably going to be the least technical presentation of the week. So just a spoiler alert: I'm not going to be going too deep into the technology or the use cases. Well, I will be talking just about some use cases, but really, I think the reason that the committee and Lena suggested that I might be a useful speaker is because of my role over the last 10 plus years as a sponsor. So within large pharma or medium to large pharma, I've had positions that have led to the establishing a vision, a strategic roadmap, and then the funding of technology as it gets implemented into the pharmaceutical R&D space. And so in that role, I've played the executive sponsor on many programs, including the source of securing the source of funding. And so I bring to you today kind of that perspective, and some of the messages that I'll be delivering are kind of the lessons learned from 10 years of that type of sponsorship. I use the graphic of a puzzle, a jumbled set of puzzle pieces, partially because one of the things I'm going to be looking for feedback and conversation on is, where does the puzzle piece of graph technology fit as we assemble what I refer to as the modern data architecture. And so this is a question that we've been grappling with a little bit over the years, particularly as we think about how we build out systems and capabilities and bring data together to benefit patients. And it's not always been clear how or where or what the best use of graph technologies are. And so I think it would be it's a useful conversation to drive, and perhaps some of my slides will help trigger some thoughts on that. So I look forward to follow-up conversation over coffee, et cetera, to talk a little bit more about that. So I have the clicker and I can get started. So I'm just setting the stage. I wanted to set some context, talk about the journey towards modern architecture, use some constructs like triggers and ideal versus what you have, data operating model as a construct. How do we leverage trends and follow trends? I've come to learn if you're fighting a trend, you're not going to make much progress. But if you can get behind the trend, you can go far. And then talk about change. And we've already had this morning a brief conversation about how change is hard, particularly in a complex environment like a large multinational, multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company. And along the way, I'll be drawing some of the lessons. So first and foremost, I want to talk a little about my journey in my career. I started out as a biochemist in the Midwest, went to Indiana University, joined Lilly right afterwards, and they funded both a master's in science in biology, immunology, but also an MBA. And I was one of those early folks who, when I went to my scientific boss and said, "Hey, I'm not going to get a PhD. I think I'm going to get an MBA." It was like, "Well, what the heck is that? What mixing business and science? Why would anybody want to do that?" And now that's pretty routine, but back in those days, it was almost unheard of. I did move into consulting and did 13 years with PA Consulting Group and then Accenture. And it was really at Accenture I started to get involved more with technology. So the implementation of digital technologies as it applies to pharmaceutical R&D. And then I started a series of roles with Wyeth, GSK, Celgene, and the acquisition of Celgene by BMS brought me to the last 3 years of my career, which has been with BMS. I did step out of BMS in April and am joining a startup in the data products, data mesh space. If that sounds vague, it is because it's purposely vague. We're still working on what exactly we're going to be doing, and hopefully knowledge graphs will be part of the solution set. One of the things I wanted to point out on this journey is, I kind of had an awakening roughly around the GSK times about how data within an organization is both its life fuel, but also value creator, but also can be mismanaged. And I use the example from GSK where when I joined, they were under a consent decree with regulatory authorities. And their consent decree was because in their product space, in the diabetes space for Avandia, they were having challenges providing to the regulators all the complete data sets. They had run something like 740 clinical trials of Avandia around the globe. The FDA asked for all that data. They could only provide 710 studies, so they were missing data on 20 studies. And you kind of scratch your head and say, how can a pharmaceutical company be missing data? And they kind of knew they weren't missing the data, they just couldn't find it. And so the FDA gave them a year and said, well, you're gonna have to find it, give you a year. And they had to go back to the paper records in Iron Mountain and recreate all the CRF data from paper records. That was a $35 million and 12-month effort. And of course, they handed it to the FDA. FDA said, thank you very much. Now we want all the data on Tykerb, their cancer drug. And as they were looking for the data on Tykerb, they found the original other 30 studies from Avandia. And that was, of course, causing great concern amongst management. How could we be that loose with our data? And so that put them on a very significant path of data integrity, data quality, data care. So that was kind of my awakening, I think, in my journey for, what can go wrong? How do we do these things better? I won't say that I knew what to do about that back then, but I knew that something had to be done to do better. Okay, so first off, I thought I might say, well, what do we mean by kind of the journey towards a modern data architecture? And if we think about our business, pharma, the business value is bringing new medicines to patients faster. And the underlying kind of use cases for data and the needs are kind of laid out in this series of connected circles, moving from understanding to judgment. And, we talk about the lifeblood, the data being the lifeblood, and it's, we want to be a data-driven organization. But the reality is many of the tools that have been installed over the years, and if you think about kind of the trends in data, relational databases, data lakes, I'm going to go backwards because I was going to say, those are probably 95% of the dollars invested to manage data fall in kind of one of those two categories. And they don't really get us too far down the journey towards supporting judgment and decision making in a research setting. And so question is, what additional technologies could potentially help get us and bridge us to this gap? And here it's been 10 minutes almost in my talk, and I've yet to use the word generative AI, but if you layer over the top generative AI, it has to act upon something, and where's that data going to come from, right? And so that's I think the base premise. And oh, by the way, can we really put solutions and tools in place that are going to feed and accelerate decision making and judgment within this pharmaceutical R&D setting? And so I think I put the cloud there just to kind of represent it. That chapter in the story hasn't been written yet. But it's certainly given the hype cycle that we're in, it's moving quickly. There's really kind of two macro trends I think at play today that talks about a movement towards a modern data architecture. One trend is the productionization of data, and that in this concept of product, it started to permeate IT as a function where we wanted to turn systems into products that we manage as a life cycle. You design a system, you deploy a system, you manage that system, and it has a life cycle. And you put it out there for people to use as a product. The same is true about data. We can design data, we can put it out for use cases, it gets consumed and used, and you get feedback from consumers on what's the fit for purpose and utility of that data. So I think this productization trend is happening as we speak. And then the second trend is for technology within an organization moving from the units that they manage from systems and being systems and technology centric to becoming data centric. And we actually adopted that phraseology within the organization I led, which was digital and IT for Bristol Myers Squibb's a research organization. We said we want to switch from being system centric to data centric. That is a hard pivot, folks. Let me just warn you then up front. So those two trends, I think, are something you want to lean into. So now, I build this as some lessons learned along the way. So lesson number one, I never pass up a good opportunity that presents itself. And one was a triggering event that occurred when I was at Celgene. And the triggering event went something along the lines of, hey, I'm a month into my job. I'm meeting with a senior translational scientist. Tell me about your approach to data management. Oh, I'll tell you about my approach. Here's my bag of thumb drives. And I asked him to, this isn't the actual picture, but I asked him to take the bag, spread out it on the table, and I took a picture of his bag of thumb drives. And he was very proud of one of them. It was like, oh, that blue one in the middle, that was a $3 million Covance biomarker study. I'm like, oh, this is a challenge. So I took that picture and I put it into my presentations, and I promised to keep him anonymous so he wouldn't be exposed to who it was. But I put that into the presentation and was talking to senior R&D leadership about this problem, and the president of research, his hair just caught fire. Couldn't believe it. This is how we manage our data? Yes, this is how we manage our data today. So that set us on a journey, the journey to improve. And of course, we all know why this is a challenge. This becomes dark data. It's not in any of our systems. We can't find it. He loses the $3 million. Oh, by the way, if he does put it into a corporate system, now we got two copies, his copy and the other copy. So all kinds of issues with this dark data, the data that's can't be found. So that event in this piece of advice of take advantage of that. So I use that picture over the course of 7 years, saying, here we're going to get this out of the system, and here's the steps we're going to take to do it. And I was able to point back to that picture when we had actually achieved what I thought was a better way, right? And so that was a triggering event that got a lot of mileage. So I thought I would put this up just to kind of refresh or touch on the fact that the pharmaceutical R&D process is complex. And for those, I didn't take a poll of the audience, but I'm assuming since this is the Health and Life Sciences Symposium, you kind of have this view already in your head. But even this doesn't really kind of speak to how deep, dark, and complex this overall process can be and is. And it's not linear, even though it's represented here as a linear process. It's research. Things cycle back. And there are significant trends at play as we try to pull human understanding of human biology back forward into this process. And in fact, there's a really interesting trend going on at the start of the process where a lot of large pharmas are trying to get more and more into understanding the causal basis of human disease biology. And you might say, well, surely they've been doing that for 30 years. But the reality is, they get a target, they start pounding compounds at it, and they test it in an animal model. Oh, it doesn't work. Start a new target. Start pounding compounds at it, test in another animal model. So it's a very kind of siloed, fragmented, and experiential or experimental driven approach, it's not as informed as one might think. And so in today's world, we're trying to get more of the causal understanding of human biology upfront to drive the process to get better probability of success, et cetera. That is a very significant undertaking, and it requires data to be connected and findable and usable throughout. And so this problem statement at the bottom, processing data across our value chain, highly fragmented, highly siloed, making finding, joining data to drive insights a challenge. Now we want to layer generative AI over the top of all that mess. I don't know how that's going to help. I actually had a picture. I don't want to claim, being prescient, but 3 years ago, put in front of research leaders, hey, AI and ML is coming. Our data is not ready. That presentation just went right over their heads. What are you talking about? So, one of this trend of productization of data. On the other side of productization is consumerization, and I think we're all very accustomed to having these in our pockets now. We as consumers of data consume a large amount of data through applications. We don't, we satisfy our quests for data and knowledge on a daily basis, but within a corporate environment, that's just not as simple as it might sound. And so two questions we got consistently and every year when we do our IT strategies and roadmaps is, why can't we just have Google for our own data? Surely it should be simple just to find our own data. Why can't we just put all of our data in one place? Because then we can find it and we can get it. And, oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, neither of those two things are easy to do, right? Now, as we dig into it, it's, and I always love, I present this bar chart because I always love, some smart academic group out, or not academic, but consulting group out there saying, well, data is really important, and people said they could be much more productive if they can find it. And so, well, yes, of course, but what are you going to do about it, right? What can you do about it? And the experience in the 10, 15 years of investments that I've been part of trying to make search capabilities better has really not come to fruition fully. Whether because there's the approach, the indexing, approach is not sufficient, which is one of the hypotheses, but really perhaps the next phase, applying graph and bringing semantic and generative AI solutions to the space, perhaps we can have a change in productivity of findability of data, information, and knowledge across the enterprise. I'm a little sensitive saying this here in front of Tom because I'm guessing AstraZeneca probably has already solved for much of this, but you're perhaps further down the path. But there are still corporations that struggle with this mightily. So I thought I might do is present kind of an idealized view, because I'm going to tell you how it's not working in a minute. But if we think about kind of the organization of data across a corporation as layers, there's a transactional layer where a lot of the business processes and workflow and data creation and systems that manage all that live. Then there's an integration layer where data is brought together. Maybe it's brought together for the purpose of a data warehouse feeding a specific business process like screening or structure activity relationship. And then there's a semantic layer, which allows you to describe all the data and give it a language and connect it and make sense out of it. And then there's a knowledge dissemination layer where, 5 years ago, we would have been talking about the analytics and visualization tools. Now we're talking about generative solutions, generative AI, to be able to extract knowledge and distribute it and disseminate it to consume it. So that's the idealized view. What's the reality? Well, first of all, the semantic layer rarely exists. And if it does, it's in pieces and parts. And so take that out. Can't find it anywhere. Nobody wants to make the invest in it. It's costs too much, and you can't find the business case for it. The other is each one of those transactional areas are hairballs. There's data hairball underneath each one of those That's because we've probably got, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 electronic lab notebooks in our landscape. So the ELNs are all very different, and the LIMS systems don't connect up, and the transactional data is getting pushed into somewhere, and it's not none of it's connected. So I've used the phrase data hairball on many occasion, and it tends to get research leadership's time and attention when I use that phrase. And then what's the other problem? Well, you would think the integration layer it would be useful to have just one data warehouse or just one data lake, but in reality we have many, right? And so you've got this complexity in the integration layer and how to bring data together. And then, of course, you've got some tools to do those analytics, but then you got to hardwire that all together. And this is just I think I put the note at the bottom to say this really underrepresents the complexity. I couldn't hit copy paste enough times on the data hairballs and the green lines. So this creates this brittle, rigid, hard to change network of data sources and data production and data consumption. This isn't how a modern data architecture should look. It's unfortunately that's how it works. So I've gotten this far in the talk, and I thought I would pause for a moment and just because I think I posed this question a little bit at the beginning to say, okay, so where does kind of graph technology, where can knowledge graphs kind of help us on the journey towards a modern data strategy and architecture? And again, I'll invite you all to kind of help me answer that question. If you have some thoughts and ideas, certainly would like to hear them and see how they might apply. So I mentioned earlier about triggering events. So triggering event number 2 to talk about was this industry's largest acquisition of a company, which I was part of, Celgene. I was getting acquired into Bristol Myers Squibb. This is a triggering event that comes along rarely in one's career, but you can take the opportunity, right? And so the opportunity was, hey, we have a very large need. We got 3-year integration program. Tom was saying that the AstraZeneca metamine was 7 years. We tried to squeeze it all into 3 years, which was, I don't recommend to anybody. That's right. So 14 research sites, 400 plus IT systems, 200 plus petabytes of data. And this graphic didn't come from that, but I thought it was kind of cool looking, and it kind of these two very large organizations connecting. And oh, by the way, halfway through it, we decided to acquire another company, which just threw it all into a complete tailspin. But associated with that was $140 million of investment to bring these two organizations together. This was an opportunity. The opportunity was, hey, can we apply some of that money to actually fix our underlying data challenges and data problems and try to get to a connected whole data ecosystem? And so that was one of the prevailing thoughts in the moment at the time. Little did we know how hard that challenge actually was, and perhaps with the help of Lena and others and her colleagues at ZS, we started to embark on some of that challenge. And so this triggering event was quite a useful one, and which brings me to another lesson learned, which is, consider your operating model carefully. And there's really kind of two directions, the top-down and the bottom-up views of data and data operating model. And we all know kind of at the enterprise, you're boiling the ocean. At the functional domain level, you're picking through grains of sand. And so you can't, the lesson we kind of take away is how do you balance? How do you strike the right balance between enterprise and functional domain? And so, questions like, can we establish a design pattern broadly and then do projects that adhere to that pattern? Can we establish standards? How do we bring flexibility and experimentation to the corporate environment to allow us to move forward quickly with new technologies? And then are we prepared to scrap what we already have in order to switch to something new? And that's probably one of the hardest questions to answer. Because if you've got something, you want to sweat that asset, and you don't necessarily want to always be churning through the next latest, greatest shiny object. And so this tension between enterprise and domain is a real one, and it's hard to get right. One of the keys is to have conversation with your colleagues and embrace kind of their positions and bring them to the design and solutioning table early. Otherwise, you run into things like cybersecurity reviews you can't get through in 9 months, or other challenges like, hey, you can't use that tool because it's not a standard. Well, bring them along, bring the enterprise along. And of course, R&D and research itself are the mavericks. We tend to be always on the cutting edge. So if you don't have good relationships with the enterprise, you're never going to make forward progress. I present this tool. This is one of the tools we kind of used early, and I started in the Celgene days, and then I used it at BMS. It's a big picture of data. I would ask research leaders, kind of, do you understand kind of what our data state looks like? And of course, the answer was, nah, not really. Well, here's one picture of it, and this is something like 235 data entities connected through something like 1,000 plus relationships across the research R&D enterprise. And what this allowed us to do was to paint the big picture. Hey, here's everything that, a representation of our data. But you know what? We need to solve some local problems. Local problems like, we don't really have a system that connects projects to targets to compounds. That's kind of a problem, right? So how do we know where that data lives today, across the heritage Celgene, heritage BMS space, and how do we connect that data together in a virtualized way? Do we build another system? We've already got 400. Do we need a 401? Or do we just kind of pull it together in a virtualized manner? And so this was a useful tool to paint the big picture and then go after and solve local problems. Another useful lesson in the early days of integration was find the killer use case. And in our case, it was a matter of timing, where we were putting in a new animal study management tool. So this in vivo tool, which was being proposed to help manage the 6,000 animal studies across the research enterprise. And it's a very complex set of processes. It's easy at the beginning, the study method and execution parts. The analysis, where you're sending out something like 3 million samples across a distributed network of labs, both internal and external, and then trying to get that data back in a controlled manner, so that you can do analysis and then eventually reporting, was actually quite a challenge. And so, the prior state on that was there was no unified systems. The primary, the assortment of outdated systems had lots of redundancy and were disconnected. And the primary data analysis tool was Excel, which is a version of a thumb drive in the middle of our business process. And there was no ability to look across. And here we had 14 research sites doing animal studies. And you mean to tell me you're not sharing information and knowledge about this tumor model with somebody who's running the same animal model in Boston or in Cambridge? So anyway, so the future state that we were able to act upon, and in a minute you're going to hear me talk long and lovingly about FAIR, making data fair, but that's essentially, we use this vehicle, this systems project to make data fair, and we across a unified information model, leveraging ontologies and taxonomies, simplified set of harmonized systems. We did implement graph. We put a knowledge graph over the top of this so that we could do things like look across studies and traverse key data entities. like assays, which is a really challenging thing to do. Um, and so staying with the boil the ocean versus grains of sand analogy, this is a version of a sandcastle. So this is where kind of value gets created. So let's talk about FAIR. So one of the trends that we decided to lean into was an external one, which is, hey, the industry is starting to embrace FAIR data. FAIR data stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It's a concept that really I think was born perhaps in Europe. So a lot of the European pharmas are further along. Tom's probably sitting here and say, well, AZ's done this for years, and no, BMS had not. We got started on it about 3 years ago, around the time of the integration. And it was a program of work that wasn't obvious to start. So it was like pushing a rock up a hill to get it moving. And I talk about my role as a sponsor. I personally made it my mission to get this off the ground. And so I found kind of the small interventions that we're going to try to move this thing forward. So one was, if a project comes forward with funding, you weren't getting funded unless you had a component in there to make data fair. And so it's these small steps that are required to move the organization forward. Sorry, so some of the value of that is making data such that it's supposed to be human findable, but also machine readable, machine actionable. And this is a concept that I think the IT organization take a little bit of time to embrace, but it had important implications. For example, when data is created, at the point of data creation, like coming off of an instrument, how do I make that data fair so that a human downstream doesn't have to data wrangle all the metadata and the experimental data, et cetera, et cetera. So this machine readable, machine actionable was a really important construct to get the IT organization to embrace FAIR. So we put together a strategy with a process. How do we design and implement a FAIR across an organization that matches our ambitions? And basically we said, we're going to do this through every IT project that comes along. So if an IT project, we have the hood of the car up, we got our hands in the engine, we're going to make the system and the data fair. And so it starts with this, and we leverage the process at the bottom where we discover all the artifacts and the blueprinting of the processes, et cetera, et cetera. We'll model that against our conceptual data model and reference vocabularies, taxonomies, and ontologies, contextualize it into a graph around the business process, and then provision data through conforming APIs and other ways to deliver data. That was quite a heavy lift to get an IT organization to understand it, but then also to get the business to embrace it. So how do we make sure that they are brought along in the process? And that leads us to this major lesson learned about it's complex change. Change is hard, has to be managed. And so, humans don't like to change. They really have to be brought along in that journey. And so I leveraged an old consulting model that where to get to overcome. So this equation A plus B plus C must be greater than D. To overcome the financial and emotional cost of change, three conditions need to exist. One is we need a consensus that the business as usual is not sufficient. So everybody has to agree what we're doing today is crazy. And you saw earlier some of the crazy, right? The bag of thumb drives, etc. You need a vision for better. You need to know how to get started. And so we put all those components in place to get FAIR moving at BMS. And I include this slide because I like to say, really it's only about 1/3 about technology. The 2/3 is about changing process and people. And that's the hard part. And then of course there's a goal and a desire to, okay, it's one thing to do FAIR internal to the organization, but how do we drive it across the industry, because not only do we have to be fair, but our suppliers, CROs, collaboration partners, et cetera, need to be fair. And so this needs to be a macro trend that we need to continue to lean into to push across the organization. And I showed earlier the conceptual data model that BMS, we started at Celgene and BMS just released that to the Pistoia Alliance under the hopes that we can continue to build a consensus for the industry, a consensus conceptual data model that everybody can agree, yeah, that's how our data can be described. It's the vocabulary that we can start to build together and can be used across. And so fair is something that I think gives us some solid footing to start to share and expand on our data capabilities. So I'm not done with the lessons. One is, you're probably wondering, when is he going to get to talk about graph? Where's the knowledge graph stuff? So we, embarked on a series of projects with scientific leaders across research to start to understand how can we leverage data in new ways and start to answer research questions. And that was kind of under the mode of innovation experimentation between the technology side of the house and the science, the research side of the house. And so, but we didn't want to do it just as kind of the one-off questions. And so, here's an example of some of these questions. These are projects that we've done over the course of the last 3 years, trying to find combinations for cell therapy constructs. So if you hit one target on a cell, what would happen if you hit two, and which two would make the most sense? These are questions that there's already answers perhaps out in the literature, but can we mine our internal data? And if we only had a model by which we could, and the data aligns to that model to bring that data together, can we answer these questions? And we started on this journey with some simple questions, got to harder and harder. And so, this one's a question of inference. Does the clinical symptomology of a monogenic disease, rare disease, does it have anything relation to some polygenic diseases like inflammatory bowel disease? And so can you make those inferences using automation and tool sets like a knowledge graph? And so made some really good progress demonstrating that. But those are kind of the grains of sand, right? And the better approach, or the approach that we were hoping to do, is over time build, use these as seed crystals to build out a much larger knowledge graph. And I think that's what we've been kind of trying to sell to the organization to get traction and build a useful value engine based on kind of the connectivity of these key data entities. I think you quite quickly see that can be a knowledge graph. You can automate its capturing data from the literature and then the feeding of internal data into that knowledge graph. I think there's still I'm sure there's use cases or examples or case studies out in the world where people have done this on a persistent basis, but I think this forms the basis of a good knowledge engine in a research organization. And then going back to the point earlier we said about satisfying data consumers' quests for data and knowledge, and we were looking to build some endpoints that allowed for folks to interact with this complex hairball of data out there. And so we put together a semantic search tool. We've leveraged some of the technologies listed here. Some of the sponsors are in the room, so I'm sure you're happy I included the logo. Thank you very much. And the challenge, of course, with these types of tools is, and I always say it's not the first questions researcher wants to answer, it's the 10th. And so they, how do they traverse from first question to the one they really need to answer? They don't even know what that question is yet. Can they use these tools? We need even more flexible and facile tools than just a facet-based semantic search. So getting back to our how do we solve and move beyond the move beyond kind of the current state or the state that we know is not a modern data architecture. Well, first of all, we kind of got to get rid of the data hairball. So there's a lot of work to be done kind of at the transactional layer. I described how we did that for the animal model, animal study management system. We need to perhaps bring in ChatGPT. Is that going to solve many of these challenges? Well, I think there's experiments being run across every organization today to figure that out. I think, this is where maybe data product comes in. And of course, I had to make a pitch for it since I'm joining a company focused on this. So who in the organization will start to own program, target, candidate, study, patient as data products? And how do we kind of put a discipline in place to both design that and make that data high quality? And can that model of data productization solve for the research complexity and take the industry to the next level of fair data? And what role will graph play in that transition? You saw that I had included now the semantic layer as being a critical component. That gives context to data, allows you to find it and use it more rapidly. And then, of course, we're doing this out of the benefit of new medicines for patients. And then lastly, final lesson learned, because I was asked to speak in kind of the context of being a sponsor, really aligning a long-term vision and then sustaining sponsorship, and that's the key, are absolute requirements. All too often, sponsors go, yeah, we'll fund that project. And then when the going gets tough and the budgets get cut, nobody's investing in FAIR, nobody's investing in ontologies, nobody's investing in the semantic layer, it all falls away. So you have to be sustained in your sponsorship. I think I put in here the reserve 5% of capacity to innovate and experiment with a goal of proving value. I am a big believer in that. In fact, my teams would kind of know this was baked in. Of course, we're going to have 5% reserve to innovate and experiment. And then I thought this was a cool picture. It's not actually the picture I was looking for, but once you're on your bike and folks jump out of the woods, the bears jump out of the woods and knock you off your bike, you have to be ready, prepared to get back on your bike and keep going. You've got to stay the course. And so that's what most of these comments are about, is, in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity, stay the course, keep going, don't get sidetracked, et cetera, et cetera. It's a critical component of making progress. To summarize the whole lot of lessons learned. And I'm going to stop here for questions. I think I did it in time. That was a flyby.
So while we get the first questions queued up, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So I was curious, a lot of this reminds me of what the federal government tried to do with data.gov, and I was curious, obviously that's not sufficient for what you're trying to do, but did you have any lessons or takeaways from that effort?
Yeah, so, we at various times kind of looked to the outside to say, where can we learn and what lessons can we bring in? And I don't know that we specifically looked at data.gov. Which component in your mind, did you think kind of would fit, or what lessons could be drawn from that effort?
Well, I mean, so they had basically the idea was that there were a number of data resources, either files or APIs, that they would first off, there was a federal mandate. If you have data, you have to publish a record of it in data.gov.
Okay, so let's stop right there. So mandates. Researchers hate mandates.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, so that would have been dead on arrival. So you've got to find the subtle ways to make mandates look like their idea, right? So I think short answer is, I think taking a constructs like that is quite useful. Looking to the outside to bring that in, but you have to recognize kind of the the dynamics that are that happen on a daily basis. I said earlier that folks don't like change. I mean, even a simple change in so implementing fair data principles. Well, one thing we could ask for is, hey, could you capture your metadata a little bit better at the point of experiment, like either design or experiment, write up or reporting, and even that extra, if it takes an extra 5 minutes, it's not going to happen, right? So what are the tools? Can you automate that? Can we bring metadata together and pre-populate the experimental record? Possibly. Yeah, so I think there are ideas out there like that, where there might be ways to mitigate or overcome, this idea of, yeah, your point is well taken. It's interesting. There is a mandate that exists, and that is, thou shalt complete your electronic lab notebook record, because if you've not completed your experimental record, you're going to jeopardize IP, you're going to jeopardize everything down the stream. Even that was ignored, right? And so the human element has to be considered. So.
Thanks. Great talk. Thanks very much. Would you mind putting your lessons back up again?
Sure.
Some of us want to take a picture, but also I have a follow-up
See
question.
if I can get back there. Nope.
Oh,
I'm screwing
go
it
back.
up. One more. I'm pressing the button.
Oh,
Now I've
you're
gone too
close.
far.
Oh,
There
there.
we go.
Okay. So great set, and I'm going to take a picture as soon as I stop
Sure.
talking. But with the advent of large language models, generative AI, et cetera, do you think any of these become more important, get modified? What's your thought process? Like, I think you could have given this talk a year or two ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, before this
Yes.
really took off.
Yes.
But do you think any of those get modified?
I think the lessons are still useful. I think, particularly number 5, find a killer use case that matters to the business. I think, it's a technology adoption question, perhaps, and what's the best way to approach this new technology and its adoption. So finding killer apps is going to give people a sense for, oh, this is real and it can have an impact. So, and by the way, I asked myself that same question. I'm like, okay, this is talk still relevant in the LLM world? Well, that chapter's not been written yet, right? And so I think, if you would have asked me that question I would say even 4 weeks ago, I would have said, well, we're in the middle of a hype cycle. This is probably perhaps the largest hype cycle known to man, and is there a crash coming? And the crash coming could be because we can't train models on internal pharma data sufficiently in a time frame that people are expecting it. So 6 months from now, if we haven't solved we haven't delivered value from an early killer application, people are going to go, hey, whatever happened to that generative AI thing? Is it being applied to I don't think that's going to be the case. I think the case we will find application. It's being found every day. I'm, hearing from my network that, hey, we tried this and it worked, and we're doing this now and we're trying that. And so there's a lot of experimentation and innovation happening. But I do think that there's still, all of this is still needed. To take full advantage and get full value from large language models and generative AI. I think so. I would listen. There's no better thing to focus folks' mind and say, hey, we had a problem and it got solved, and it's delivering value. Yeah, I in some ways, if I reflect on my own reaction to the hype around generative AI, my former boss, the chief digital and technology officer, when we presented on those use cases, looking at T-cell modulation and use of knowledge graphs, and in that case, we did use ChatGPT. to try to train and do entity recognition better. My boss at the time responded, "Oh, that's interesting, but I was coding up ChatGPT to search for and find product information in the commercial space." Oh, okay, so it's a shiny object, and that's the challenge. Is it a shiny object, or is it going to be incorporated into the real implementations?
We have a couple more questions, but we're also running short on time. So if we could just do these quickly.
Real quick. Sorry, that was a long one.
I'll be really quick.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Great talk.
Thanks.
How far back, do we go in trying to, compile this data into a new data? Because there's so much data, and it's exponentially increasing in the medical research field.
Yeah. Well, so I have two answers to that question. One is, if you're in a hole, stop digging. So when you create new data, make sure it's fit for the future, right? So fix the data creation problem. And I have a very specific answer. In the case of the animal management study, the 35,000 studies, anything before 2014 is not of use, because they changed systems then. And before that, it was even worse. The data was just unintelligible to be reassembled. So I think it depends on the use case and the data sets. There's probably some trigger or a tipping point where said, oh, that data is not of use, and that data is. And so I think it's situational. That's the answer to that question, which makes it even more complex.
Hi, how are you doing? I'm Tyler Beck I'm with the NIH. So have you thought about, with the upcoming change to the way that publishers are not going to be able to have an embargo on their papers anymore, have you thought about how you could go try to work with publishers, because they're going to be looking for new models of how to keep their business alive, new revenue.
Sure.
So have you thought about how some of these things can work directly with publishers on finding ways to improve their metadata around the publications, things like that?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting challenge and opportunity. I think, and this goes to make an impact, to change the dynamic. I think the industry perhaps has to speak with one voice, and try to work with the publishing industry to figure out what that model might look like. I love the idea, right? If you particularly associated data sets with full article, full publication, that's more available, more readily connected to a web of data and knowledge. Incredibly powerful stuff. In fact, if we want to solve the complexity of human biology and disease, we need that. But that's hard. Partially because each one of those publishers, they're trying to gain an advantage over the other, and they don't want to do it as an industry. So anyway, let's have a conversation about that off of coffee.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.